All right, welcome to our explainer. Today we are diving into a really fascinating rare genetic disorder. It's a perfect case study really for understanding how one tiny little faulty enzyme can cause problems all over the body. We're talking about Alkaptonuria, which you might know as the black urine disease.
So let's start with a question. What if your urine turned black just by being exposed to the air? I know, it sounds like something out of a detective story, right? But this very striking sign is actually the classic hallmark of this disorder. It's the first major clue that puts us on the trail of a very specific, single molecular error.
We have to give credit to Sir Archibald Garrod. He was a real pioneer who studied this condition more than 100 years ago. And he had this brilliant insight. He realized it was a perfect example of what he called an inborn error of metabolism. It's basically the textbook case of an autosomal recessive disorder. That just means you've got to inherit a faulty gene from both parents. And it shows us so clearly how a single hiccup in your genes can throw a wrench in an entire metabolic pathway.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the biochemical pathway and how it's supposed to work. Then we'll see what happens when it breaks, leading to all the symptoms. We'll cover the diagnosis and then wrap up with the absolute core facts you need to have locked in.
So, first things first. To get what goes wrong, you absolutely have to understand what's supposed to go right. So let's trace the normal breakdown pathway for an amino acid called tyrosine. I want you to think of this as a 5-step biochemical assembly line. Our starting material is tyrosine. It goes through this whole series of changes, each step driven by a specific enzyme. And what's the end goal? Well, it's to break tyrosine down into really useful stuff, like fumarate, which can hop into the TCA cycle to make energy, and acetoacetate, which is a type of fuel called a ketone body. It's a super elegant and efficient process when it works. But what happens if that assembly line breaks down?
And here it is. This is the exact spot where everything goes wrong. The problem is at step 3. There's an enzyme called Homogentisate oxidase, and in this condition, it's either missing or just doesn't work right. This creates a total roadblock, and that beautiful assembly line just screeches to a halt.
So because of this roadblock, the substance right before it, that's homogentisic acid, or HGA for short, it has absolutely nowhere to go. It can't move forward to the next step. So what does it do? It starts to build up, and I mean it builds up in a big way. You get a massive accumulation in the blood, it gets deposited in tissues all over the body, and it just spills over into the urine.
And this brings us right back to our first big clue. All that excess homogentisic acid in the urine, well, when it gets exposed to the air, to oxygen, it undergoes a chemical reaction. It oxidizes and forms these long chains, a polymer that creates a dark black-brown pigment called alkaptone. And that's what makes the urine turn black.
So now let's shift gears a bit and look at the clinical picture. It's pretty amazing how this one single biochemical error can send ripples throughout the entire body, causing a whole range of symptoms that show up over a person's lifetime.
You see, the black urine is really just the tip of the iceberg. That same exact pigment that darkens the urine also starts to deposit in the body's connective tissues. We call this process ochronosis. This is what leads to that bluish-black discoloration you can sometimes see in cartilage, like in the ears, or even in the whites of the eyes. And over many years, this pigment building up in the joints causes a really severe degenerative arthritis. It can even affect things like heart valves or lead to kidney stones.
This progression is really slow but steady. In childhood, the only clue might be darkened diapers. The patient feels fine, but that damage is silently starting to accumulate. Then by early adulthood, maybe in their 20s or 30s, the physical signs of ochronosis start to show up. And by the time patients hit their 40s and beyond, that debilitating arthritis often becomes the biggest and most painful problem they face.
Okay, so we've got these really unique clinical signs. So how do we actually confirm a diagnosis in the lab? Well, no surprise, it all comes back to finding that metabolite that's building up in the urine.
The cool thing is, the diagnosis really relies on the unique chemical properties of HGA. I mean, the simplest test is just observation. You let a urine sample stand and see if it turns dark. You can even speed it up by adding an alkali. There are other chemical tests too, like the ferric chloride test, which gives a quick flash of blue color. Now here's a tricky one. The Benedict's test will be positive. HGA is a strong reducing agent, so it can give a false positive for glucose, which might throw you off if you're not careful. But the gold standard, the definitive test, is gas chromatography/mass spectrometry. That's how you directly measure the massive amount of homogentisic acid and say for sure, yep, this is Alkaptonuria.
All right, let's boil all of this down to the absolute essentials. This is your high-yield summary, the stuff you absolutely have to know for your exams and for clinical practice.
If you only remember 4 things, make it these 4. The defect is a homogentisate oxidase deficiency. The substance that accumulates is homogentisic acid. The classic clinical triad is black urine, ochronosis, and arthritis, and it's an autosomal recessive disorder. Now, when it comes to management, the goal is to slow things down and treat the symptoms. This means things like restricting the amino acids that come before the block, phenylalanine and tyrosine, in the diet. Vitamin C might also help slow down that pigment deposition. And for the arthritis, it's all about symptomatic treatment. There is an experimental drug, nitasinone, that actually works by blocking an enzyme earlier in the pathway to try and reduce how much HGA gets made in the first place.
And look, to help you lock this all in your brain for good, we've got a fantastic mnemonic that wraps up the whole disease really nicely. Just think, homogeneous black.
Let's break it down. It's perfect. Homogentisate is what builds up. Oxidase is the enzyme that's deficient. It's a metabolic block that causes ochronosis. It's a genetic disorder, and its classic sign is, of course, black urine. See? It's all right there for you.
You know, Garrett's work on Alkaptonuria was truly foundational. It helped establish the whole one gene, one enzyme idea. This revolutionary concept that a single gene is responsible for making a single enzyme. It's such a simple model, but it explains a complex disease. And that really leaves us with a huge question to think about. As we tackle all the complex diseases we see today, how many of them might, at their core, be traced back to similarly specific, but maybe still undiscovered, molecular errors? It's something to keep in mind as you continue your studies. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.